Greetings, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This has been quite the winter and quite the spring for us here at the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. Been doing a lot of different webinars, and hope all of you are enjoying them. So let's go over a couple of the basics here. So first off, we would love to thank the Office of Violence Against Women for, of course, funding these. Yay, for being able to do webinars, right? That's always a good thing. It's always a great thing. This webinar is interactive. So that means you can participate. Yay! Not only is that great for me, but it's also great for you. So I want to make sure that everyone on the webinar is getting as much as they can out of this webinar and learning a lot and getting their questions answered. There's, of course, a number of different ways for you to get your questions answered and to contact me, but I would love to be able to do that here as well. All right, so here is what your control panel for this webinar is going to look like. If it doesn't look like this expanded version, make sure to click on this little orange arrow button, and it will expand it or it will retract it, right? And that little button can be either on the left hand or the right hand side of your screen. It just depends. Sometimes it'll open, in different parts of your screen. So just look out for that. And then there's this little raise hand button, and you can click it if you want to, ask questions or something. But generally, we are using this question box here at the bottom. This question box is awesome, and if you've been on one of our other webinars, you know that we utilize this question box. So let's utilize this question box right now. If you could, would you just type in, where you're from? What are you, a system advocate? Are you a community-based advocate? Are you from law enforcement? Kind of tell us who you are. Tell us where you're from. You just click on that question box and type kind of like you were going to ask the question, but we're going to trick it a little bit. No, I'm just going to put a little answer in there. All right. Ooh, we got a lot of cool folks here. It looks like we have some social workers, a couple folks from up north in the Park City area. We got folks from the south in the Washington City area. We have folks from Ogden. We have hospital crisis workers. That's really cool. Folks from social service. We have someone from TikTok. That's really cool. And I always love when folks from out of state attend these webinars. Like, I feel real good about that. It looks like we have someone from Alabama. That's really cool. Folks from Head Start. A couple of child advocates. That's great. That's really great. Folks from the Davis County area. We have someone from a new state. We have someone from New Jersey. That's awesome. That's really cool. I'm really glad to see all the folks who have come out today, or maybe chilling in their office watching this webinar. That's great. Thank you, everyone, for doing that. Additionally, I have included a handout of the presentation that we will be doing today. So on your control panel, there'll be a little option for handouts. You can click on that PDF on the title of our webinar that we're doing right now, and you can download that so you can read along if you like, or you can save that for later. You can write notes on it, stuff like that. So awesome. All right. We have one of my favorite slides. No, I'm just kidding. Well, of course it is. It has pictures of my cats. What can I say? So my name is Andy Tremonti, and I work for the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. And I'm the education and outreach coordinator for the coalition. So my job is basically to be over all of our trainings and educations that we offer at the coalition. So I do our 40-hour trainings. I do a webinar every 2 weeks. What? Every 2 weeks you could join me and interact and learn something new? It is true. It is true. My background, my education background is in the psychology and women and gender studies, which happens to fit pretty well with, talking about and navigating that domestic and sexual violence. All right, and I have about 8 years of working, I think it's going on 9 at this point. I'm working with LGBTQ and other underserved survivors of trauma and all forms of trauma. About half of that was with youth, and the other half is with adults. Right? And if you look here on the left, there's little tree people, right? Those are dryads. When I'm not presenting, when I'm not creating curriculum, when I'm not, researching, what I'm doing is I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons, or I'm prepping for Dungeons and Dragons. It is a very excellent form of self-care. I definitely recommend it. It's time consuming, right? And it's hard to think about some of the, the things that we hear, some of the things that we experience throughout our day when you're painting on facial details of, 2mm, face. So, and now here on the right, I have pictures of my cats. So the one on the left is Toriko, and the one on the right is Jorge. And Jorge's going to be 16 in a couple months, and yeah, he's my old man kitty. I love him. Last but not least, I live in Utah. Utah, we have wonderful forests. We have wonderful mountains. We're very lucky to have the wonderful wildlife and outdoors things that we do have here. And you'll catch me in the forest. You'll catch me going on hikes, mountain biking. I seem to have a lot of hobbies, but yeah, there's a little bit about me. All right, so let's get into it. So today we are going to talk about humanizing, advocating, and supporting male survivors, right? And so this is a topic that a lot of folks have a lot of questions on. And hopefully we can get your questions answered today, and hopefully we can increase those advocacy skills for working with male survivors. Okay, so here's a couple of the things that we want to be able to do today. So the first one, we're going to understand those barriers to service that male survivors face. We're going to challenge and dispel a bunch of those myths with male survivors. And that's a big thing that you probably have noticed from webinars that we've done in the past, that we do a lot of dispelling of those myths, right? Which we break down those myths and we talk about why those myths are there and what we can do to counter those myths, right? And increase those services for survivors. 3, we're going to learn how to effectively advocate for male survivors of domestic and sexual violence, right? Excellent, excellent. And then the 4th one is we're going to go over best practices for working with male survivors. So first off, let's go over the numbers. Let's talk about let's look at this, a snapshot of, the folks that we're working with, that we're advocating for. So we have some numbers from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. So this report says that 26% of gay respondents, 37% of bisexual respondents, and 29% of heterosexual male respondents reported either experiencing rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner throughout their lifetime. Right? And down here at the bottom, this dot point, for example, when we talk about like in the military, so from 2012, 53% of the sexual assaults that were reported in the military had male victims, right? And so, think about when we talk about domestic and sexual violence, a big part, one of the biggest parts of sexual and domestic violence is power and control, right? So think about how sexual violence and sexual assault against folks, especially male folks within the military, can be a very effective way to gain that power and control over someone. All right, let's get to the next slide here. All right. So let's talk about sexual violence for a second. So 1 in 71 men have reported having been raped at some point in their lives. So this is really interesting. So we have 52% that said they were assaulted by an acquaintance, right? And so think about how we would define an acquaintance. So folks on the webinar, a lot of us are service providers, a lot of us are folks that work within the community and work with survivors. So the way that we would identify an acquaintance is someone that the person knows in some way. And that would include someone maybe you met off Tinder, someone that you met at the mall or something. You may not be friends with them, you may not be close with them, but you are acquainted with them in some way, right? You know something about them, you had a conversation, and you decided, hey, let's hang out or let's, hook up, right? However, when we talk with survivors and how survivors may define acquaintance is someone that they're more engaged with, maybe someone that's not quite a friend, but someone they know pretty decently, right? So like a step below friend, and a stranger would be someone that they have never met, they don't know, right? So keep that in mind when we talk about these numbers, right? And this third dot point, 1 in 21 men have been forced to penetrate someone else. So think about that. The first dot point, 1 in 71 men have reported being raped at some point in their life, and 1 in 21 men have been forced to penetrate someone else. Would you agree? Would you say that being forced to penetrate someone else would be rape? Probably, right? Because that person, where's the consent in that interaction, right? Is that person consenting to that penetration? Is that person consenting to that interaction, right? And so this is really interesting, and this is something that you'll see throughout this presentation, and maybe folks who have worked with male survivors, this is something that you may notice, is that maybe the way that they communicate what has happened to them or communicate lived experiences, that they may put them in different compartments, compartmentalize, like, no, that wasn't a rape. That wasn't, I was forced to penetrate someone, right? But there was no consent there. So that would meet the definition of a rape, of a sexual assault. So down here at the bottom, so 27, so almost 28% of male rape victims were raped before the age of 10. So think about that, right? So think about not only the prevalence of childhood sexual abuse, and for Utah, it's 1 in 5, right? But think about how many people have been victims of sexual violence, right? And maybe the way that they're reacting, maybe the way that they behave, later in life as teenagers, as adults, maybe a result, maybe even have something to do with that perpetration, that violence that they experienced when they were children. That's really important to keep in mind. And you may not hear about it. This is something that folks that you work with may never talk about. They may talk about it in a very vague way or kind of beat around the bush, but we know that this is happening to almost a third of those folks, right? Okay, so now let's talk about stalking. The last webinar we had was on stalking, and you can watch that via YouTube, and there will be some links that will be sent to you for you to be able to access that. So 1 in 19 men have been stalked in their lifetime, right? So this is really interesting. So these numbers are very, very interesting. And let's, again, talk about how we define stalking, how we define this violence towards folks. So say, let's give an example of, how about a college campus, right? So say you have two folks, they have the same class, you have a man, you have a woman, right? And generally, college campuses, there's 1 or 2, maybe 3 different ways to get to a building. Usually there's some sort of, system, right? So say they go the same way to that class, right? So say he sits behind her in class and, taps her on the shoulder and says, hey, your hair's really cute. I really like your makeup, or you smell really nice. That's a really cute shirt, right? Maybe says, hey, let me take you out to dinner. Let's hang out. You're really pretty. I really want to take you out to dinner, right? maybe he gets her number from maybe some group work that they did together, maybe from an online part of the class like Canvas, gets her number, texts her, say, hey, I got your number from so-and-so, or I got your number from Canvas. Let's hang out, right? Let me take you to dinner. You're so beautiful, you're so gorgeous. Let me take you to dinner. Maybe send some lewd photos, maybe send some dick pics, right? Do you think reasonably she would feel stalked? You might feel harassed? Yeah, we could reasonably say that she probably would, right? So let's kind of change the tables here, turn the tables. I think that's the right way to say it. So we have, college kid folks, they travel the same way to the college class. She sits behind him, taps him on the shoulder, like, oh, I love your beard. Your beard's so hot. Gosh, that flannel shirt is so flannelly. It's just so great. Oh, I love it. I love it. You're so attractive, right? Like, let's go get coffee. Let's go hang out. Like, let's study together, right? So say she gets his number from maybe group work that they've been doing, maybe, online portion of the class, that Canvas, and texts him and says, hey, let's go out for coffee. You're really cute. You're really hot. I want to hang out with you, and maybe send some pictures of maybe some, lewd photos or photos where she's not dressed, or maybe send pictures like, ooh, look what I'm doing, or something like that may not be appropriate, right? Do you think that he may feel harassed? He may feel stalked? Probably not, right? And what do you think will happen when he goes to his friends and say, hey, this girl, this woman in my class, she's been, sending me these pictures, she's been talking to me, she sits next to me, I don't know what to do. What's oftentimes a response that you hear, survivors or folks say is, their friend might say, well, dude, is she hot, right? And stuff like that. So think about how he may be perceived, or how he may be received by friends, family, advocates, folks at the school, right? And that's really interesting. So we talk about that, and then we go to the second dot point, which is really interesting, because it almost goes directly against the first dot point, right? So almost 76% of men have received those unwanted phone calls, texts, and voicemails, right? So it's happening. It's happening to men. It's happening to masculine. It's happening to boys. It's happening to folks, and yet they're not defining it as stalking. They're not defining it as harassment, right? And of course, these last two dot points. It's really interesting on the last one that 1 in 14 were stalked between the ages of 11 and 17. So think of the last time you saw an 11-year-old. Think of an 11-year-old being stalked by someone at school, maybe a neighbor, a friend, family member, coworker. Like, think about how, well, maybe not a coworker if they're 11. Let's be careful. But so think about how, yeah, that's scary, an 11-year-old. But it's happening, and we even have data that folks are reporting it and saying that it is happening. Okay, so here's some numbers about violence by a partner, right? So an intimate partner, right? Someone they've dated, someone they've lived with, etc., etc. So 1 in 4 men have experienced rape, physical violence, and/or stalking within their lifetime. So 1 in 4. The national numbers for women are 1 in 4 as well. For Utah, the national numbers would be 1 in 3 for women and 1 in 5 for men. Or excuse me, Utah numbers are 1 in 3 for women and 1 in 5 for men. And then 1 in 7 men have experienced that severe physical violence by an intimate partner. So 1 in 7 men, that's a lot more. When I was doing this research, years ago, I was that did surprise me a little bit, right? Because you hear a lot of these myths that, oh, well, that doesn't happen to men, and and this doesn't happen to men, and women aren't violent, and right? But in reality, we know that this is actually happening, and folks are not talking about it, right? So about almost half of men have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner, right? And sometimes you'll hear about that. You'll hear like, oh, like my girlfriend is, you hear, oh, my girlfriend's crazy. She's always yelling at me or something like that. Or, my boyfriend, he doesn't let me talk to other men or something like that. And it's like, oh, that is intimate partner violence. Yeah. Okay, so now let's go into barriers, right? Oh, someone submitted one of in the question box submitted when we were talking about the stalking stuff, that someone might reply as saying like, "Oh, you're lucky," like that. Oh, someone's so pretty or someone's so attractive will be talking to you. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, that's definitely something they folks here. All right, so now let's talk about barriers to service, right? So we're going to talk about a bunch of different barriers to service in this section. So first off, we're going to talk about gender norms, right? So how do gender norms contribute to male masculine, survivors not reporting or not even identifying that this is happening to them, right? So we have male rape myths, right? We have domestic violence or sexual violence services catered to women and children, oftentimes having like Center for Women and Children or Women and Children Crisis Center, stuff like that, and how that can be a big barrier, right? Beliefs that men are perpetrators and not victims, so men are always perpetrators, or that men's biggest motivation is to perpetrate violence against women and girls, right? And throughout history, we've seen this specifically perpetrating violence against white women and girls, right? So there is an aspect of race and racism involved in a lot of these interactions. So high burden of proof, right? So not only, gosh, it's hard in general to, prove that you have been assaulted or that you've experienced domestic or sexual violence. And then you have this element of masculinity, right? This idea that you should have been able to fight them off and stuff like that. And of course, the questioning sexual orientation, accessing mental health services, and victim blaming, right? So let's go over a couple of these. All right, so here is a poll. So basically how this works is a poll is going to pop up on your screen and just click the answer that you feel fits best. So our poll is, do you think domestic and sexual violence against men is underreported? All right, and that should have popped up on the screen. So go ahead and answer that. And we will get that closed and we get a bunch of folks' answers. We have about 35% of folks that have voted so far. So just click the answer that you agree with, or the one that you feel fits the best, right? We have yes, there are significant barriers to reporting. We have yes, there's a lack of training by service providers. We have no, men can't be victims. We have no, domestic and sexual violence only really happens to women. And then we have unknown or other. We have about 65% of folks voted. Get a couple more folks voted before we get this closed out. All right, let's get this shared on your screen. Hopefully you see, yep, you should see the poll on your screen now. And it looks like 100% of you voted yes, there are significant barriers to reporting. That's great. I'm glad to see that. I'm really glad to see that happening here. So yes, absolutely. There are a number of barriers folks experience in reporting domestic and sexual violence in general. And then when we have these intersections of these identities, these marginalized identities, yeah, we see increases in barriers. And we're going to talk more about that right now. All right, so here is a quote. So when talking about prevention or advocacy, we rarely talk about violence against men, and when we do, it's as perpetrators or allies in prevention of violence against women, right? So think about that the majority of victims of violent crimes, like mugging, murder, stuff like that, are men, right? And so we know that it happens to men. We know that domestic and sexual violence and stalking happens to men. We know, right? And it's really, really interesting to kind of see the way that we are, even like trying to include or including men is kind of leaving their stories out. which is really interesting, especially as survivors of sexual and domestic violence. The same things that affect women, like gender roles, patriarchal gender norms, things like that, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, all these things affect men as well, and they affect men differently. And it's really, really interesting to see that, right? It's interesting to see that when we have a system that values and devalues certain folks, that everyone in the system gets affected, even when they think they don't, or even when it seems like they may not be affected, right? So this is perfect. It brings up intersectionality. And if you've heard of intersectionality, if you've been on another one of my webinars, we talk about intersectionality a lot because it's very, very important, right? Because the intersections and interactions of our marginalized or devalued identities and those systems of oppression that come into play are really, really important, right? So how system of oppression is defined is a system that gives certain groups power and takes power away from other groups, right? So think about, like, for example, folks, say, going to the ER for maybe a heart attack versus going to the ER for a sexual assault. So you have, a white heterosexual cisgender woman who was assaulted and she goes into that, right? And so depending on the hospital, they may have services, they may have a room specifically for SANE exams, sexual assault nurse examiners that come in and do those exams, right? They may not. And then think about what happens when a gay man of color comes in who was just assaulted, and how differently will he be perceived? How differently will the hospital staff maybe interact with him, right? Are they going to be like, well, do we put him in the room? It's assault. Like, what do we do, right? And even think about folks who's maybe not native English speakers, right? So think about folks who English is their second language, right? How are folks perceived, and how are they able to interact with these systems of care? How are folks able to interact with advocacy programs, with advocacy organizations, stuff like that, when they may not speak the language that is spoken within there, or they may not have an identity that is shown within the employees or advocates and stuff like that, right? And so this is really important, right? So remember that intersectionality is defined as the intersections and interactions of our marginalized identities and in relation to systems of oppression, right? So how do our identities interact with those systems, and how does that change the way that we're perceived and change the way that we perceive the world, right? Okay, so this goes right into privilege, right? So think about, I love this little quote here on the left-hand side. So privilege is when you think something is not a problem because it is not a problem to you personally, right? So, I mean, even think about when we're passing laws, think about VAWA, right? We're trying to get VAWA reauthorized. And think about the folks that are in charge of reauthorizing that and some of the things that they're talking about, right? They're like, oh, we need to take this out and this, and it's like, so this person has not experienced maybe some of the barriers that folks who are victims of domestic and sexual violence experience when they're going to get services, right? When they're entering those systems of care, right? Maybe that person's native language is English, right? Maybe that person doesn't speak another language, right? And so they don't think that it's a problem when service providers don't have bilingual advocates, or they, think like, oh, well, why do you need a bilingual? Like, no, these are ways that we decrease barriers and we increase, these healing, feelings of healing and feelings of like justice, right? Because that's what we want to do, is we want to support the people around us and create a place where people are validated and people are able to heal, right? And so, yeah, this, privilege, intersectionality, all these things go hand in hand with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, right? And it's really, really interesting too, because privilege, this is a really big conversation, and a lot of folks may have their experience with talking about privilege or understanding privilege is on a very basic level, right? They may hear like, oh, white privilege, right? And they may, feel attacked and stuff like that, you know, et cetera, et cetera. However, the understanding of privilege is much deeper than maybe surface conversations that we're having, right? And privilege, you know, is not necessarily a blanket thing. You know, you could be privileged in one identity and not privileged in another. So, you know, think about, you know, this intersectionality of identities. You know, you think you have a white transgender gay man, right? And so that intersectionality of that person is definitely, you know, has experienced that white privilege aspect of it, right? And then these other marginalized identities may not be privileged within those identities. And think about when we talk about male survivors, right? They may experience gender privilege and even, you know, racial identity privilege, and may not experience that privilege as being a survivor and receiving services, right? If that makes sense. Oh, okay, well, this is excellent. This is a perfect question, right? So on the question box, answer this question for me. So in what ways might male victims be negatively affected by gender privilege? So how can male survivors, male victims, how are they negatively affected by the privilege, like, you know, male privilege, the gender privileges that they may have, and even perceived privilege, right? How are they negatively affected by that? This is a very interesting question. So in that question box, just type in your answers. All right, got a couple coming in. Oh, so someone said not many services for men, right? What else? What else do you think? All right, so not being believed because they should be able to protect themselves, right? Well, you're a man, so you should be able to fight people off. You're stronger, right? You're supposedly stronger, right? Lack of services, not being able to talk about it, right? So think about how masculinity is a very confining box that folks fit into, right? So men being seen as abusers, and even think about, oh, this person said that forms say he when referring to abusers, which is very interesting, right? So it's just assumed that men are always abusers and that men cannot be victims, right? Even disbelief, right? All right. Oh, we had one come in that says people calling them quote unquote lucky for their assault because sex is seen as intrinsic to masculinity, right? Think about, oh, that's excellent. So think about so when you read in the news, when you read of like teachers abusing and assaulting and having quote unquote relationships with students, right? And it's really, really interesting. So think about the ways that it might be talked about in like news reports and police reports, stuff like that, is that so say a male teacher assaulted a female student, that female student abused by male teacher, and then you turn the tables and say it's a female teacher abusing a male student, right? Male student has affair with female teacher. If you're 14 and your teacher is having a relationship with you and it's sexual in nature, that is sexual abuse. That is not an affair. That is not a consensual sexual relationship. That is abuse, right? And it's really interesting how that's kind of portrayed, right? So yeah, they're stronger, so why would they allow it? And even think about the idea that it doesn't happen to men. How can it happen to men, right? So these denials, right? So think about how interesting that is, right? So there's, privilege experienced in this, this gender privilege experience in many forms, in many ways. And then when we come to this survivorship, this victimhood, is that there's almost a blanket denial of, no, this doesn't happen to us. Like if it happened to you, then it's because you wanted it. You didn't fight it off, right? So it's so interesting, so interesting. So thank you everyone for chiming in on that. Thank you, I really do appreciate that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, go into depth on some of the stuff that y'all kind of said a minute ago. So men and boys who display behaviors typically viewed as feminine in nature are at increased risk for all kinds of victimization, including sexual violence. So why do you think this happens? So think about this. We have a couple different, let me see if I can get the drawing tool out here. Okay, so we have a couple different things here. So we have this idea as things that are feminine are seen as weak, right? Less than, that, if you're feminine, you're emotional, you just want to nurture folks, you're not strong, you don't fight back, all these different things, right? And then we have this idea of these men and boys adhering to the standard of masculinity, right? So this masculine standard dictates that you either are upholding these standards, you are constantly proving, you are constantly showing that you are masculine and that you are strong, that you are tough, that you are not emotional, that you are in control, right? And if you don't constantly uphold this, if you don't, show this, if you don't constantly prove this in literally every interaction that you have, then you can become the victim. You can become the person who is now the target. So if you're not the aggressor, then you're the victim. If you're not the one who's upholding, then you're the target, right? So it's really, really interesting, and it's really important to see or to understand that being feminine is very different than being less masculine, right? So remember that being feminine is different than being less masculine. And there are different degrees of social sanctions. There are different degrees of punishment for those things. And it's very, very interesting. So think about, we talked before, sexual violence is a tool that, folks use to gain power and control over other folks, and men use it to gain, power and control over other men as well, right? All right. Okay, so here's a little quote from a male survivor of sexual violence. So there's a stigma attached to it, right? That, oh, you're a man, you should be able to fend him off. And even folks who are here, who are service providers, who have worked with survivors, that it's not about, physicality, right? That there's different ways that people are gaining power and control over others. And oftentimes we just assume that it's physical, right? But what has happened in this person's life, and what has happened with that person who has perpetrated the violence upon them to gain that power and control, right? So look at this list, right? This is a pretty short list. What does a victim look like, right? So when a victim comes in, is there a poster on your wall, by your door that shows you what a victim looks like? And when that person walks in and says, I'm a victim, if they don't fit that exact look, then you're like, oh, I can tell that you're not a victim. No, right? Victims come in all different types. Victims look and act differently, right? So think about this. Have you worked with a victim? Have you worked with a survivor who is a leader? Not only a leader in their community, maybe a leader in their family, maybe a leader in their social group, right? Have you worked with a survivor who was badass? Yeah, most of us can definitely say that, right? Have you worked with a survivor who was strong, emotional, sad, weak, tough, powerful, vulnerable? Yeah, you have, right? And so think about how these words, these adjectives, right? These descriptors are used to describe a victim and describe survivors, and how each survivor is different. Each survivor can be similar, can be the same as one that you've worked with before, but survivors can look like anything. They can act like anything. They can be anything. And it's really important to understand that the survivors don't come in one shape, one packaged version. So this is really interesting. So when we talk about how humans respond to being victimized, there's a number of different ways that we respond, and there's a number of different ways that we react to that, right? So depression, I'm sure you've seen this working with folks, right? Even maybe some sadness, right? Aggression. You know, think about survivors that come in and they're mad, right? They're maybe you know, misplacing that anger and that aggression onto the service provider, onto the law enforcement officer, right? Because they're mad. They're struggling with what has happened to them, right? And that's very common. It's normal. It's natural, right? Having anxiety, right? Not only anxiety in going into a service provider's or going into a law enforcement, you know, his office, but also just anxiety that that person, you may see that person has perpetrated that violence against you again, and that can be really, really very scary, right? Sexual dysfunction. So think about how many survivors you've heard that say, I don't know if I can have sex again. Like I just can't do it. It's really hard, right? I just don't trust maybe. And think about when we talk about like ED, or like erectile dysfunction. And it's really interesting. There's, you know, been a bunch of studies that, you know, have talked about the role of like adolescent sexual abuse, right? In maybe erectile dysfunction in folks who are in their 20s and 30s, right? And yeah, it's really interesting. So think about how that could affect you, right? That if you were assaulted, that could be really, really difficult to do again. Do something sexually that even mirrored or was anything similar to that, right? So think about substance use, right? We talk about substance use, and oftentimes it's looked down upon. Like, well, why do you have to, you know, drink so much, or why do you have to, you know, take OxyContin? Like, why do you have to, you know, do that? Like, if you don't do that, then you can feel better. But when in reality, we know that folks who are going, you know, through situations, who have been traumatized, who are currently being traumatized, that substance use is an escape, right? So it's a behavior that they're using to cope with what is happening to them, right? And so it's really good information to know that this person may be using substances, right? To understand where they are and the needs that they have, right? So think about relationship problems, delinquency. It's really interesting with delinquency because think about youth so kids in school, right? And you have a child who acts out, who maybe pushes another student, who calls another student worthless, or says that you'll never be anything. Where did that kid hear that? Where did that kid experience that? Right? Is he seeing it at home? Right? Is she seeing it at home? Are they seeing it at home? Right? Think about what we do to those children, right? Is a child acts out, right? It's like, oh, we are a danger to everyone else. You need to be punished, right? When in reality, what is happening? What is happening to that child? Why are they responding that way? Why is the child, you know, a kid in your class who is constantly falling asleep, who can't stay awake? What is happening to the kid who cannot pay attention? Were they able to sleep the night before? Are they in a place that is safe to sleep, right? Are they thinking about what will happen when they get home, right? So think about all these things that we criminalize and we punish when they're really good indicators that something is happening, right? So poor parenting, yeah, think about how you know, being in a situation can result in poor parenting. Maybe you're trying to survive, maybe you're trying to cope with the situation, and it's not you know, very adaptive or very, very helpful or validating of that child experience, right? Self-harm, intimacy and trust issues, low self-esteem, and anger, right? Let's talk about anger. Let's talk about it. So when we're working with folks, when we're even, you know, interacting with family members, you know, loved ones, lovers, partners, dating partners, you know, acquaintances, we're used to anger that, you know, looks what we call, I guess, aggressive, right? So think about silent anger. Right? Think about isolation, right? Someone's maybe upset, mad, angry, and so they isolate themselves from that person. They don't want to hang out with that friend group anymore. Like, think about those. Think about tears, right? I know when I'm angry that I cry. I'm a little cry goose, right? When I get so angry, I just like start crying. Think about being quiet when you're angry, right? Similar to silence, right? Maybe fight for your rights. Think of how many survivors have come in and want to be volunteers. How many survivors have come in and say, hey, I want to give back, right? This happened to me and I want to help folks in the future, right? One thing that we're not used to is yelling or mad anger, right? So think about a survivor who was victimized. Think about a survivor who has been in an intimate partner violence relationship for 3 years, right? Think about someone who was assaulted by their partner, right? Do they have the right to be mad? Do they have the right to be pissed? Absolutely. I would be pissed too. I would be pissed if that happened. I'd be so angry, right? And remember that as a service provider, you can set boundaries. Boundaries are great. Boundaries are great. Not only for yourself, but for survivors, right? So say you have a survivor, you're working with a survivor, they're in your office, and they're maybe getting angry, maybe you're feeling uncomfortable, and you can say, thank you for sharing those feelings, right? Thank you for sharing that. It sounds like that was a really difficult situation, right? And, give them a safe place to validate their feelings. And of course, you can say if it's not directed at me, right? And if it does become directed at you, then you can set those boundaries, right? But remember that anger is not necessarily a bad or a scary thing, right? That humans experience anger and humans experience these feelings, right? All right, so again, in that question box, I love me that question box. So will you answer this question, right? How can you validate those feelings of anger? What can you say? What can you do? If a survivor comes to you and is feeling angry and is expressing that anger, what can you do? Go ahead and type that into that question box. Oh gosh, okay, we got a bunch coming in already. That's awesome. So assure them that it's not their fault, right? How many survivors come in and think it's their fault, right? And then are angry because they quote unquote let it happen, right? Reflect and normalize their feelings. Yeah, right? Use those active listening skills, right? Ooh, I like this one. Tell them flat out that their feelings are real and that their feelings are valid, right? Keep a calm demeanor and tone, right? Listen to them, give them time and space, let them know that their feelings are normal, right? Because their feelings are normal, right? These are normal feelings, these are normal responses to an abnormal situation, right? Saying, this sounds like this experience was horrible. This experience was it terrible, frustrating? It's okay to feel anger, right? Yeah, normalize those feelings. Oh yeah, compassion and general care or genuine care. That genuine care. It's really hard to fake that. The genuine interactions with humans, which is really really interesting, right? You could even debunk myths, let them speak, even moments of silence. I even know when I'm a little cry goose when I'm sad, is that it is nice to have that silence from that other person, that person just listening. So then I feel that I am able to kind of control when I want to say the next thing or kind of like maybe sit in those feelings. So that's really cool. Thank you, everyone. That's really great. And of course, one of the last one is not quickly jumping in with advice, right? There's advocacy and validating feelings is very, very different than giving advice, right? Giving resources when they're asked for, and giving resources when that's something that you and survivor may have come together is like, hey, you need some resources and consented to that, then that's great, right? But unwanted advice doesn't really help. Okay, so now let's talk about gender norms, right? We are going to have a webinar on gender socialization, I believe next month, so I'll get that out to you. That'll be really interesting. I think this will really help the folks on the webinar as well. So masculinity, right? These ideas of being strong, of putting work before those relationships and families. You know, being that what, like the breadwinner, right? What is it, like bringing home the bacon, right? You know, being dominant, being unemotional, being entirely motivated by sex, right? And think about how these stereotypes, how these almost sometimes even standards, right, can really affect men and masculine folks who have been victimized, right? So think about, you know, folks who have been sexually assaulted. Like, can they still be strong? Can they still be a breadwinner? Can they still be a provider for their family? They absolutely can be, right? So it's really interesting because this whole, you know, list, all these different things that we're talking about, where does that leave survivorship? Where does it leave it, right? Can one be a survivor and be strong and masculine? Right? Very, very interesting. We know that you can, right? All right, so these next 4 things, I call them, like I said before. So we're going to talk about heteronormativity, cisnormativity, homophobia, and homophobia and transphobia, excuse me, and how they affect male survivors, right? And not only how they affect male survivors, but also how they affect us as service providers, us as advocates, us as law enforcement, in assisting and supporting survivors, right? So heteronormativity, this is the belief that everyone is heterosexual, right? And that those who are not heterosexual are less than or inferior, right? So I'd like this picture to the right. How many times have you heard someone asking, you know, a gay, lesbian, queer couple, so which one of you is the man? Which one of you is the woman, right? And so they're unfortunately they're trying to ask, you know, who does what? How are your roles defined, right? And believe it or not, people can define their roles and their boundaries on their own, right? But this does, you know, confuse folks. But I love this picture here to the right because this explains it very well. And so part of that is, how does this affect male survivors, right? So, you know, gay or bisexual men being questioned about their relationship, right? Maybe asking like, well, tell me more about this relationship. So you're gay, so is it because of that, or what's happening? You know, rather than actually focusing on the abuse, right? Even denying that the incident, the abuse, the assault is even happening, blaming it on the person's identity, right? Saying, well, if you weren't gay, or if you would repent, you know, if you or whatever, then this wouldn't be happening to you, right? So now we have cisnormativity, right? So cisnormativity. So this is the assumption in individuals and institutions. So this is very similar to heteronormativity, but it has to do with gender and gender identity. Can anyone define cisnormativity for me? Could anyone type into the box and define it for me? Let's see. Let's see if we can get someone to define it. Cisnormative, or excuse me, cisgender, being cisgender, I apologize. So what is cisgender? Someone define that for me. Cisnormativity. All right, so someone said, oh, we got a bunch of people that popped in. So someone who identifies with the gender they were born of, maybe identifying as a sex, one is assigned at birth, gender assigned at birth. So excellent, thank you all for chiming in. So basically cisnormativity, or excuse me, cisgender, gosh, I gotta stop looking at this slide while I'm trying to say this. So being cisgender, so basically your gender identity, so your sense of maleness, femaleness, multiple genders, or no gender, is congruent with, or quote unquote matches, your sex assigned at birth. And so remember how our sex is assigned at birth, right? is that the doctor looks at our genitals and says, hey, you meet the standard for male, so then you must be male, or you meet the standard for female, so you must be female, right? And so it's a little bit, more complicated than that, especially when we're talking about folks who are intersex, right? And so intersex folks, may not fit into those standards, right? And so oftentimes they are left out of not only conversations, but left out of just general the identity world, right? So the majority of people probably on this webinar would identify as cisgender. Someone who's maybe not trans, that's a very basic definition there. However, the term is relatively new because generally we don't come up with terms that describe things that are norm or the norm. We come up with things to describe things that are different than the norm because we already know what the norm is, right? So we don't need to describe them, right? So an example of this is, this bag, right here. Is it a boy or a girl, right? So think about it, right? Is it a boy or a girl? How do you think that affects people? How do you think that, being an it affects humans, right? Dehumanizing those humans. Think about how babies, they don't even gain personhood until they have a gender, right? And that's really interesting. That's very, very interesting, right? And oftentimes a follow-up question would be, are you happy that it's a boy or girl, or is that what you wanted, right? Think about gender reveal parties, right? Gender reveal parties, you see them on Instagram, you see them on Facebook, right? And, folks, they have their bags, they have their buttons or whatever, and, they reveal, this is, boy or girl, right? And oftentimes I want to comment and say, hey, just wait a couple years because you may be wrong, right? All right, so yep, there we go. Is it a boy or a girl, right? So very, very interesting. So very interesting. Okay. So the idea that everyone is cisgender and that those, we already went over that. I want to go over this bottom part. Oops, got a little excited there. So how does this affect male survivors? So blaming an abuse, or blaming the abuse and the assault on the identity, disregarding that victimization. So think about when we talked about heteronormativity, blaming the victimization on that identity, saying, well, if you dress like the man that you are, then nothing would happen. When that if someone is transgender, that is very, very painful and very hurtful to say to them. And think about folks that are going into to get services or something, and maybe an intake worker, or maybe an officer, or an employee says, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't serve ... right? I can't even tell you how many cases male survivors that I've even worked with that the first thing that they talk about is, I tried to go somewhere and they said that we don't serve men. It's like, gosh, that would be really difficult to hear, especially being a survivor, is that flat out, we just don't serve men, and that's really hard. It's really hard to hear. So now we have homophobia, right? I'm sure you've heard this. I'm sure, people have talked about it, right? And so it's really interesting because in the definition of homophobia, we have this irrational aspect to it, right? So irrational fear, or fear, right? And some folks are like, well, what? That doesn't make sense, right? How can I fear something, right? I'm not afraid of gay people. I just don't want them to teach my kids, right? Have you heard that? So I want to combine this fear aspect of it, of homophobia, and of transphobia really quickly, right? So transphobia is that fear of transgender people, right? Or people who don't conform to rigid gender and sex role, stereotype, right? So fear. I want to break down fear really quick. So in the question box, I would love for you to tell me, how do humans, how do people, how do community members, how do advocates, how do we, as survivors, how do we respond to fear, right? So think of avoid. That's one of them. So give me a couple more. How do we respond to fear? You tell me. How do we respond to fear? All right, we're getting a bunch in here. Getting a bunch in here. Ooh, fight or flight. Yeah, that's a big one. Anger, close down. Freeze. Convince himself that it doesn't exist. Maybe judge other people, lash out, or make jokes. Recoil. Ooh, yeah. Isolation, right? So isolate yourself, not only from the thing that's scary, but also maybe feeling like you can't interact with that, or you need to stay away from it, right? Withdraw, on the defensive, yeah. Humor is a big one. Think about how many times you hear someone say an offensive joke, or maybe a family member, maybe a friend, maybe like a comedian on their Instagram, they say something really offensive and they're like, oh, it's just humor. Like, now I can't say anything, right? No. Like, think about how humor is oftentimes used to justify bad behavior, to justify really terrible things, right? So let's look at a couple of these. So here's a list. So here's these are a compilation of some of the most, I guess, popular ones that people come up with in my trainings, right? So of course, avoid is always number one, right? And if let me get the writing tool out here again. So what about these two, friend and flop, right? So especially when we're talking about folks who've experienced childhood sexual abuse, right? Is that maybe they are friending that person who's perpetrating that violence against them? What if it's a parent? What if it's a cousin? What if it's an aunt or an uncle, right? That they may attempt to friend or be really good or listen really well to avoid that perpetration. And then think about flop, right? So literally using your body to get away, right? And also when we talk about friends, like think of the adult version may be like Stockholm syndrome, right? Trauma bonding, right? Okay. So now I have a little pop quiz here for you. So you tell me, how is it a response to fear? So how is I don't hate gay people, I just don't want them teaching my kids? How is that a response to fear? Type that into the question box. How is that a response to fear? Ooh, there's some avoidance in there. There's a lot of avoidance in there, right? Maybe fear that they will turn your kids gay, right? That it's yeah, some sort of like communicable disease, which it's not. It's not, okay, everyone. Yeah, avoid ignorance is a big part of it. So maybe lack of understanding. What else? Oh, the idea, shove their inappropriate way of thinking, quote unquote, down their kids' throats. So that's really interesting. That's oftentimes is a response, right? The idea that if LGBTQIA people exist, if folks of color, if marginalized identity, people who speak languages other than English, that them just existing is somehow shoving it down another person's face, which is very, very interesting, right? All right, what about control? You think control is a part of that? So think about how this person may be trying to control this situation because they're fearful, right? They don't understand it, right? So anti-trans bathroom laws and anti-trans bathroom bills, how is this a response to fear? What do you think? How is it a response to fear? Right in that question box. how is disallowing, how is stopping someone from using bathrooms a response to fear? How is controlling, hint, hint, someone from using bathrooms a response to fear? Yeah, again, someone, fear of the unknown, even shaming someone, right? Pushing them away. Again, control, right? Controlling bodies in public spaces, right? Think about how this has been done multiple times throughout the years, right? Is during segregation, when they tried to pass the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and this anti-trans bathroom laws, that bathroom control bills are unfortunately very effective in elevating this fear response and creating a moral panic, right? All right, so this last one, how is this a response to fear? We can't house men for the safety of our other survivors. How is that a response to fear? Yeah, bam, 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 really quick. All men are perpetrators. That what men are coded to do, what men are, quote unquote, naturally do is perpetrate, right? And that if a man, someone who's masculine comes into shelter or needs services, they don't actually need services, is what they're really here to do is to perpetrate violence against other people, so to control other people, right? And this is really interesting. Think about pushing away, think about avoiding, think about all these different ways that this is a response to fear, right? And think about even this idea that if we segregate women from men, that women will inherently be safe, right? Or if that we have women-only spaces and maybe shelters that will inherently keep women safe, and that's kind of what women have to do, is stay away from men. But when we know that that's setting women up for failure, is because women are going to interact with men throughout their lives, even within the shelter as people who work there, but also maybe women who are heterosexual, that maybe they want to have a relationship with someone. And so what we're doing is we're avoiding that, right? And we're doing unfortunately, we're reinforcing the us versus them. We're reinforcing these fears, right? When something that could be a lot more effective would be addressing folks maybe they're being triggered, or address that and help them work through it and help them set boundaries and teach about healthy relationships and stuff like that, right? So when we control an entire group of people, when we put laws, against an entire group of people in order to keep another group safe, it's really affecting all of us, Okay, let's go over some rape myths. All right, so it's really important to understand that rape myths and rape culture are products of heteronormative norms, right? So, this is the idea that women are weak, men are strong, that women play hard to get, and that she's not really saying no, she's really enjoying it, is that you can't, rape men because men should be able to fight off, and all these different things. So yeah, it's really, really interesting to see how this all affects each other and how this all interacts with each other, right? So here's some, specific rape myth that you may have heard. If there's one on here or if there's one that or that you've heard of that isn't on here, put that in that question box, and we can talk about that too. So the idea that men can't be raped, right? We know that men can be raped. We know that it happens and that it can be assaulted, right? Even by partners, okay? The idea that men are always perpetrators and not victims, right? The whole idea of being stronger, right? Of that it's only about physicality, when we know domestic and sexual violence are very much about power and control, and there's different ways that people can gain power and control over other folks, okay? The idea that if someone was raped, that they, must be gay, right? That if this experience happened, that it means that they are actually homosexual, not that they were assaulted or that it was unwanted, is that they must have wanted it, right? You know, the idea that trans men are not real men. Maybe the idea that how can a woman rape a man, especially if he was aroused, right? Or maybe there was an erection, right? Is how can that happen? And we know that an erection does not equal consent, right? It's that your body is responding to stimulus. That's what your body does. That's what your body is supposed to do, right? So for your body to respond doesn't mean that you're cognitively consenting to that interaction, right? The idea that domestic and sexual violence does not affect men like it does women, right? That is assuming that men don't have emotions or don't experience the effects of victimization can be really harmful. And the idea that, you know, men don't need services or they don't need to go into shelter. And it looks like we have a couple folks who chimed in. Oh yeah, that if he was physically stronger, that he must have wanted it because he could have stopped it. And so think about when you have, you know, men who maybe are athletic or you know, very physical, maybe bodybuilders, right, who do get assaulted, that we just assume, well, look how big you are. Like you work out like 100 hours a day, you know, like you should be able to fight that person off. When it doesn't work that way. That men, boys, masculine folks also respond with fight, flight, freeze, friend, and fought. Like these are our natural reactions and natural responses to that victimization, right? And that men are in fact human. It's true. It is true. Oh, perfect example right here. We got Terry Crews, right? And this was one of his tweets. So this whole thing with Harvey Weinstein is giving me PTSD, right? Why? Because this kind of thing happened to me. And if you've seen Terry Crews or if you know anything about Terry Crews, you know that Terry Crews is a very large, muscular man, right? He's huge. His muscles are so big, right? And think about how he was assaulted, right? And think about how he was victimized. And even think about how people responded to him after it happened, right? So after he was assaulted, after one of the things happened, and he did actually report it, right? And when he was tweeting about it, when the Harvey Weinstein stuff happened, you know, people were like, well, you waited a year to report. Like, why didn't you say it, you know, tell someone when it first happened? But Terry Crews did. He did, and he was ignored. He was ignored. Okay, perfect. Goes right into reasons for not reporting, right? So look at this list of why people wouldn't report, and tell me if you could tell if this person was male, if this person was female. If you could tell the identity of this person by their fears or the reasons why they wouldn't report. Can you tell that person's identity? Can you tell that the person may be fearful of the relationship that they have with that person? Can you tell the identity of someone who feels, who's blaming themselves or feels shame or feels humiliated? Can you tell the identity of someone who believes that the evidence isn't enough, right? So think about this, right? Think about these things that are happening to folks who have experienced this victimization, experienced this perpetration, right? And that they respond in very similar, very common, very classic ways, right? Okay, police, you know, response to reporting, the same, you know, as, you know, folks that may not identify as male or masculine, right? That the case was not being taken seriously, that they were maybe turned away, or the, you know, folks were like, well, why are you, you know, responding, or why are you saying that this happened? Like, it sounds like you were drunk or whatever, right? Looking into their backgrounds, right? How many times have we worked with a survivor? How many times have we worked with someone who has a criminal history, right? And how does that affect them in seeking services, getting services, even navigating services, right? Think about maybe the way that we approach someone, right? Is that we approach them and maybe we confront them in a very maybe accusatory way. Well, what did you do? What are you doing here? Like, right? Treating them as maybe victims, or excuse me, as maybe perpetrators and not victims, right? All right, so now we're on our last section of supporting male survivors, right? All right, and so we have a quote here from one of the victims of Kevin Spacey, right? So he says, in this moment, with what's happened, it's become clear that people can be believed and that it can have an impact, right? So the entire apparatus that kept people silent and also kept those guilty of harassment safe is being dismantled, right? So think about what the Me Too movement has done. Think about how it has really changed the way that people are not only responded to, people are being believed, organizations, law enforcement, government, even organizations, they are changing the way they do things because it has now been very much brought into light that the system is supporting and the system is upholding, unfortunately, these forms of abuse. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the different ways, how you can support male survivors, right? And so remember, it's really important to think about trauma-informed care, right? Trauma-informed care. So seeing behaviors as coping strategy, right? Seeing, or it being strength-based, right? Of validation, right? Of support and respecting their choices, okay? So do humans like to be validated? Do people with emotions like to be validated? Absolutely, absolutely, right? Do men like to be validated? Do masculine folks like to be validated? Absolutely, right? And think about how even masculinity, even like the identity of male, or that maleness, can even send a message that I don't need to be validated, right? Or that that's not part of being a strong masculine man, right? When we know that validation is wonderful, is great, right? And it really, really helps that journey of healing and justice. So meeting folks where they are. So remember that there's not a catch-all solution for domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or sexual violence. And that we will have to be creative in the way that we work with survivors, right? So think about the survivors that you have worked with, or maybe even stories that you've heard. We don't have a paper that we hand everyone and say, okay, follow all these instructions and you're going to be safe, right? Gosh, if it was that easy, if it was, then we probably wouldn't be having this webinar right now, right? And so be creative, and especially when we have male survivors, that there may be an organization or a shelter or something in their area that they don't house men, that they have a policy that they don't, or something, right? And so how do you get the survivor's needs met? How do you advocate? How do you support? And how do you validate this survivor's lived experience, right? When there may be substantial barriers. And think about the intersection of race, sexual orientation, gender identity in all of this, and how that can increase those barriers, right? And really understand, especially with like male survivors, and that it's not enough to just, write, okay, male survivor support group on a flyer and put it in coffee shops, right? Is that, especially if maybe your organization name has women and children in the name, that you may literally have to go out into the community and do more outreach and do outreach that may be different than the outreach that you've done before. So think about going to Alcoholics Anonymous, maybe Narcotics Anonymous, going to even tabling at sports events, tabling at, or having a fundraising night, or having a sponsorship night at your local, sports restaurant or something. Like, how are you going to communicate that you're offering services to male survivors in a way that is reaching those survivors, right? And so, and think about even like the element of trust, right? Is that you may say, oh, we serve male survivors, but that person may be like, well, last time I talked about this, or last time I, went into a place that they thought I was a perpetrator, and they, wouldn't help me, or didn't have services or something, that they may have had negative experiences before, and you will have to do some trust building. You'll have to do some trust building. And think about even like, of course, avoiding victim blaming in general, but also how is your approach? In what ways can it be re-traumatizing? How can it re-victimize this person, right? Are we blaming the victim for what happened to them? Are we assuming that they don't need services or they don't need help? Or are we meeting them where they are and supporting them in what they need? All right, so trauma-informed advocacy. This is, a major tenet is, what has happened to them, not what is wrong with them, and what does it mean to them, okay? So what has happened to them, okay? Think about how we view folks who have a criminal record, or we view folks who act out in school, or kids that act out. It's like, well, what's wrong with you? Why can't you do this? When what we should be saying, what we should be asking, what we should be figuring out is what has happened to them. What has happened to them that they are responding in this way, or they are acting in this way, right? Or that they are feeling this way. What has happened to them, right? And how can we meet their needs, and how can we support them? So we also have visual, written, and verbal cues, right? So, and in your PDF, you have these all written out. So the things that I'm saying, you'll have a slide of them. So you'll be able to actually read and have more of that information, right? So visual cues. So what about your posters? What about your brochures in your organization? Do you have male survivor brochures? And if you do, are they with the rest of the brochures so that it's normalized? And like, okay, I am a male survivor, and it's not on a table 3 rooms away or something, or it's not in a special area, that it's included in the rest of the information. And so that person is not feeling excluded. Also on your posters, do you have posters that have, pictures of men, that not only pictures of men, but pictures of men that are not being portrayed as perpetrators, right? We've all seen the classic picture of, like, think of the picture, that classic picture of, we have that white man's hand and the camera's behind it, and we have the white woman cowering in the corner, right? And so does that send a message of, hey, male survivors can come here? Or what are we sending what messages are we sending, right? Are we saying that it only happens to white folks, it only happens to white women, that men are always perpetrators? Like, what are we seeing in those, right? Do you have posters that are diverse? Are there different identities that are being shown? Is there toxic masculinity? So think of even the example I was giving just now. And even think about your employees, right? Do you have any male employees? Are there any people that are walking around? Or is the only male employee that you have your accountant or your HR person, right? And even think about that, right? So think about even within your policies. So when we're talking about written cues, so think about your policy. So not only is your name, does your name include, women and children in crisis or something like that, or women's shelter? That can be a barrier because men and masculine folks may not believe that they can go there. LGBTQIA folks may not think that they can go there. People without kids may not think they can go there. So that can be a barrier. But also in your policies. So think about having a policy that, okay, so we have male employees, right? We have male masculine employees. but they can't work in the shelter, or they can't work in the shelter overnight, or they can't be advocates. Like, so think about what message that sends, right? Not only to people who are walking into your shelter, into your organization, right? But also to the people that you employ. So what you're saying is, you can work for us, you can do things, we can pay you to do things and to, do the job duties. But if this ever happened to you, you cannot get services. You're not eligible for services here. Like, what message does that send to the folks that you work with, right? So think about so verbal cues. So think about in the language that you use when you're doing a presentation, when you're doing outreach in your even like your brochures and your conversations. Are you saying, okay, well, I'm going to use he for perpetrator and she for survivor because that's generally what I see, right? So not only are you reinforcing these ideas that men are always perpetrators and women are always victims, which we know women are not always victims and women are not always less than, and even those ideas, right? But also we're reinforcing the idea that that folks that don't fit this definition of domestic sexual and intimate partner violence, that they cannot access resources, right? Yeah, it's really, really interesting because think about the idea that if you're not seeing LGBTQIA survivors, if you're not seeing male survivors, then there's probably substantial barriers that are making it difficult or impossible for those survivors to come into your organization, right? So think about that is a pretty big indicator on the things that maybe that you might need to change within your organization, within your shelter, within your trainings, policies, stuff like that. Is that if you're not seeing marginalized groups, is that the organization may not be safe even for those groups, right? All right, so okay, so when supporting those survivors, it is beneficial to have advocates of different genders, different identities, different racial backgrounds, languages. Very, very beneficial because then you're able to serve more folks, right? But if the person is comfortable with seeing a male advocate or talking to a male advocate and even ask for it, that can be beneficial. So it's important to even have that on your staff. But also don't assume that they want to see a male survivor or a male advocate, or that they need to talk to male folks, because oftentimes it is difficult for men and even masculine folks to talk or be vulnerable with other male or masculine folks, right? Because there could be some power dynamics or something there, so that they may not actually feel comfortable with that. So safety planning, it may not be like the traditional safety planning that we may be used to, is that we have a form and we go over different parts with that survivor. Is that literally the safety planning? Maybe a verbal conversation. It may be literally someone coming in and saying, during your conversation, saying, will you give me some advice on this, or hey, what do you think about this, right? Or what is your opinion on this, right? It may not be, hey, I don't feel safe in my house, I don't know what to do, can we talk about it, right? Also, when you're working with, I think it's actually on the next page. So when you're, yeah, there it is. So when you're working with male survivors, you may not hear the words like rape, sexual assault, abuse, things like that. They may not be able to literally name it, right? It may be very difficult for them. And even think about survivors coming to terms with what has happened to them, that using that language, they may not be ready for it, right? So you may hear things like, oh, they did that to me, or he touched me, he made me do this, she made me do this, she made me say this, right? So think about, the fact that you may have to read between the lines, right? That this person may be saying that I've been raped, but they may not say, I have been raped, right? And so you really have to listen and understand that it may take a couple sessions for this person to even talk about what has happened to them or even admit that something has happened to them. And that the first, session or two, the first time that they meet with you, that they may talk about their hobbies. They may talk about the cool thing that happened to them at work, or maybe the crappy thing that happened to them at work, right? And what is happening is they're trying to build trust. They're trying to see, okay, this person is a safe person that I can talk about my emotions with, that I can talk about what has happened to me with. So remember that, especially with underserved survivors, underserved groups, marginalized identities and marginalized groups, that there's going to be a period of trust building, right? Especially when you may be, actual or perceived identity of, groups that have power, groups that have privilege, right? Is that these survivors, these folks may have not had a very positive experience before, and they may really need some time to gain that trust and to be patient, right? Be patient. Even them coming in and talking to you about the things that happen to them at work that they're not okay with, that can be really even beneficial for them, right? Okay, language matters, mirror language and emotions, okay? So if they use the word rape, then use the word rape, right? If they, maybe if they say he abused me, she abused me, using the word, abuse, and maybe even talking about rape a little bit to help maybe them understand kind of what may happen to them, but mirror that language is really important, especially also with identities. If they identify as gay, use gay. If they identify as bisexual, use bisexual. And of course, pronouns. Okay, let's talk a little bit about resources. So in Utah, we have 15 domestic violence service providers available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they offer a number of different services. So many of you who come from DVSP, domestic violence service providers, know, like, we have a lot of different stuff that we offer, right? From emergency shelter to rape crisis response. Every day, there are more and more places that are expanding and creating rape crisis teams, creating SART teams, creating SANE programs, sexual assault nurse examiner programs. So services are expanding, right? Children's services, mental health services, referrals. So even if an organization may not have the services there, oftentimes they have referrals and they can help you find other places that do. So we have the National Domestic Violence Hotline, the hotline as it's called. So 1-800-799-7233. So this is 24 hours, 7 days a week. Nice thing about this is over 200 different languages. Chances are they have someone there who can translate and who can interpret for you. So here's the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition's link line. So this is 24 hours, 7 days a week, and we have up to 150 different languages. Really important that we are not a counseling service. So even though we have this service, and generally folks in Utah call it, we can't meet with that person. We're not counselors. Not all of us are counselors, so we can't do that. And this is, of course, 1-800-897-LINK or 5465. And we have a couple folks from out of state. So we have someone from Alabama and New Jersey. And so definitely find out your state's number and information from that coalition. Okay, so here's me, Andy Tremonti. Here's my information. You can contact me here. I have actually 2 different extensions. I have the extension 106 and 104. They're so popular, yes. But so you can reach me either way, or you can you can press the training extension when you call that line. And this is my direct office line. It goes to my phone, so I'll get it either way. And you can email me. I'm really pretty quick about responding to email, as this is the easiest way to get a hold of me, especially when I'm out doing trainings or doing webinars and stuff like this. Yeah, if you have any questions, stay on. I can get those answered for you. But thank you so much for attending. This was awesome. Hopefully you learned a lot. And if you have any questions, stay on or email me after that. So yeah, I'll stay on for a couple minutes, ask your questions. And of course, in your PDF, you'll have all the list of sources and citations. So you'll be able to get all of the information, look into that a little bit more deeply. So any questions, go ahead and ask them now in that question box, and we will get them answered. Yeah, thank you for attending the webinar. And even if you work at an organization that has historically not served men, the past about year and a half, I have been doing a lot of technical assistance and working with a lot of different service providers to increase their accessibility for male survivors and LGBTQIA survivors. So get a hold of me, contact me. Let me know, and let's see what we can do. Let's see what trainings I can come and do for you in person. Other webinars, we can do Skype trainings. I can do program overviews. We can look at your policies and look at even the way your shelter is laid out. We can look at all that, and we can see what we can do to increase those services for folks. So it looks like some folks are having some issues with downloading the PDF. So I'll send that out via email. I'm not sure why that's doing that, but I'll get it sent out via email to everyone so that to make sure that you got a copy of that. All right, so it looks like we don't have any more questions. So thank you so much for attending, and I would love to see you at another one of our webinars. Thank you, everyone. Have an excellent day.